There is a hidden mechanism that has shaped every nation, every market, and every generation for the past 3 centuries. A mechanism so vast, so quiet, and so deeply woven into the fabric of modern civilization that most people never realize it exists. Yet it governs everything from the rise of empires to the collapse of currencies, from the taxes you pay to the future your children will inherit. History reveals a disturbing pattern. When England embraced permanent government debt in 1694, it wasn't merely financing a war, it was surrendering its future to a system that would outlive kings and parliaments. When European powers turned sovereign bonds into a transnational web of obligations in the 1800s, they stopped being nations and became nodes in a financial machine. And when the United States built a central banking structure capable of creating infinite demand for government debt in 1913, it lit the fuse for the modern economic world, a world where money itself is manufactured from promises that can never be fulfilled. By the time developing nations were pulled into the same structure in the late 20th century, the trap was complete. Their ports' currencies, budgets, and political decisions became collateral in a system designed not to be paid back, but to be sustained. And now, as global debt reaches unimaginable levels, we face the same truth those earlier generations never understood. The world isn't drowning in debt. The world is ruled by debt. By the time most people realize it, it will already be too late. Debt is not a flaw of civilization. It is the silent engine that drives it. A structure hidden beneath policies, currencies, and institutions. A mechanism so deeply embedded that most societies no longer recognize it as a choice. It has become the operating system of the modern world. And once a nation enters it, escape is no longer possible without unraveling the entire architecture that sustains its economy. The core truth is this: debt is power, and the permanence of debt is the permanence of control. First, debt converts time into leverage. When governments borrow, they pledge decades of future labor tax revenue and national output in exchange for immediate liquidity. What appears as progress, new infrastructure, expanded budgets. Economic stimulus is, in fact, the mortgaging of tomorrow. Every bond issued today is a contract that binds future generations to obligations they never chose. And because these obligations compound, the price of every borrowed dollar grows heavier with time. The present consumes, the future pays. This time, distortion is the first pillar of the mechanism. Second, debt centralizes authority in a way no army or empire ever could. Political power is temporary. Elected officials serve terms, administrations rise and fall, and ideologies shift. But creditors remain constant. They do not negotiate at ballot boxes. They do not campaign. They simply collect. Interest payments stand above politics, protected by law contract and the fear of default. A government can defy voters, foreign allies, or even its own constitution, but it cannot defy its creditors. This is how financial power outlasts dynasties, ideologies, and borders. This is how influence becomes structural. Third, debt reshapes the nature of money itself. In the modern system, money is not printed, it is issued through debt. Government bonds form the bedrock of global finance. Banks treat them as collateral. Pension funds rely on them as safe assets. Central banks manipulate them to steer entire economies. Remove these bonds, and the system collapses. Reduce them, and liquidity evaporates. Thus, debt cannot decrease. It must grow, expand, multiply, not because governments are reckless, but because the architecture demands it. Debt is the bloodstream of the financial world. Contraction is akin to organ failure. Fourth, debt aligns incentives in a way that guarantees its own expansion. Politicians want short-term gains to win elections. Banks want more lending to increase interest income. Investors want bonds that appear safe and predictable. Central banks want deeper debt markets to execute monetary policy. And citizens trained to believe in stability accept the illusion that borrowing is prosperity. Every participant moves in the same direction, creating a cycle that accelerates with each crisis, each recession, each geopolitical shock. This is why global debt never shrinks. Not in wars, not in peace, not in booms or downturns. Debt is not a temporary instrument, it is the defining mechanism of modern civilization. A self-reinforcing spiral that binds nations, restructures economies, and alters the trajectory of history itself. In this world, sovereignty is not measured by military strength or political resolve. It is measured by a nation's relationship to its creditors. History proves it again and again. Section Wonder, The Birth of the Mechanism, 1694, 1815. Every system of control begins with a moment when necessity outweighs caution. For modern debt, that moment arrived in 1694, when England, exhausted by war and stripped of credit, accepted a proposal that would alter the course of global history. What appeared to be a financial rescue was, in fact, the foundation stone of a new world. The rule began with a simple idea: a government would borrow money, not as a temporary burden, but as a permanent structure. William Paterson's model transformed sovereign debt from an emergency tool into a never-ending contract. The government received funding, the creditors received perpetual interest, and the principle was intentionally left untouched. It was elegant, efficient, and irreversible. Across the next century, this model spread through Europe like a quiet revolution. France experimented with centralized credit. The Dutch refined debt issuance through a disciplined trading network. By 1790, the United States adopted the same architecture, binding its new republic to the same logic that defined Europe's financial rise. But the pattern took its next great leap with Nathan Rothschild. Following the Napoleonic Wars, he created something no empire had attempted: a global market for sovereign debt. Bonds no longer belonged to a single creditor. They became tradable instruments exchanged across cities, across borders, across languages. London, Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, all connected through a growing web of financial commitments. By 1815, this web had become so dense that default no longer harmed a lender, it destabilized an entire network. That was the true innovation: make debt so interconnected that no nation could exit without triggering collapse. Sovereign choices became systemic risks. Fiscal independence became a myth. The mechanism tightened. Picture this: empires rise, currencies fluctuate, alliances break, but the obligations remain. The bonds outlive the monarchs. The contracts outlast the wars. The system evolves, but it never resets. By the time governments understood the implications, the world had already entered the age of permanent dependence. But the pattern had already begun. Section 2. The Industrialization of Control, 1815-1913. As the 19th century unfolded, nations expanded their territories, industries, and military ambitions. But behind the facade of national strength, a new force was taking shape, a financial engine capable of steering entire economies. What Rothschild pioneered became the blueprint for the next evolution: the industrialization of debt management. Governments discovered that bonds could fund everything they desired. Railways stretched across continents. Armies mobilized with speed unknown to previous eras. Factories reshaped the social order. And behind each transformation was the same mechanism: borrow, expand, stabilize, but never repay. The interest flowed upward. The principle remained untouched. Global markets matured. Trading houses emerged. Investment banks expanded their networks. By late century, sovereign bonds were not merely financial tools, they were geopolitical weapons. Whoever controlled the bond markets controlled the stability of nations. Then came the moment that solidified the next stage of the pattern: the creation of a central bank capable of generating infinite demand for government debt. In the United States, the Panic of 1907 exposed the fragility of a decentralized system. Banks collapsed. Markets froze. Panic spread. And in the shadows of crisis, J.P. Morgan orchestrated a rescue that revealed a profound truth: the nation needed a central authority, and that authority could be shaped to serve the same mechanism that governed Europe. The solution emerged in secrecy. The 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island produced a structure that looked public but functioned as a hybrid: decentralized in appearance, centralized in control. 12 regional banks guided by a board anchored by the financial giants who understood the system better than anyone else. When the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913, the rule changed forever. The government no longer needed lenders with finite capital. It now had an institution capable of creating money to buy its debt. Unlimited demand, unlimited issuance, unlimited expansion. Picture this: a government issues bonds, the central bank purchases them, money appears from nothing, and interest payments become eternal. A loop begins quiet but unstoppable. By the time the public understood the system's power, the age of infinite debt had already begun. By the time they realized it was too late. Section 3. The completion of the trap, 1913, present. The 20th century brought wars, depressions, recoveries, and revolutions. Yet beneath the surface of global turmoil, the mechanism strengthened. Debt became the default mode of governance. Every crisis deepened dependence. Every recovery required more borrowing. Every political promise was backed not by productivity, but by future obligations. By the 1970s, the system reached its next stage. Inflation surged, confidence cracked, global trade trembled. And into the chaos stepped a figure who would finish the architecture: Paul Volcker. His decision to raise interest rates to historic heights crushed inflation, but it crushed developing nations even more. Countries that had borrowed cheaply suddenly faced impossible payments. The mechanism could have collapsed. Instead, it evolved. Through the IMF, a new pattern emerged. When nations cannot pay, they are not allowed to default, they are restructured. Debts are extended, refinanced, prolonged. Austerity is imposed, sovereignty is negotiated, assets are privatized, and interest continues to flow. Default became unacceptable. Independence became conditional. Debt became permanent. The pattern was complete. Today, global debt has surged past levels once thought impossible. But the logic remains the same. Government debt becomes money. Money becomes collateral. Collateral becomes financial architecture. And the interest becomes the quiet engine of global power. Picture this: the numbers rise, the balance sheets swell, and the silence deepens. No alarm sound, no revolutions unfold. The mechanism works exactly as designed. History doesn't repeat it, evolves, and the next stage has started. In 2025, the world stands inside a financial architecture so vast, so automated, and so indispensable that most societies can no longer imagine reality outside it. What began as an experiment in 1694 has become the nervous system of modern civilization. Nations speak of sovereignty, independence, and growth, yet nearly all of them are tethered to a mechanism older and more powerful than their constitutions. Every major economy is now defined not by its resources or industries, but by the scale of its liabilities. The United States rolls over trillions each year simply to maintain its fiscal pulse. Japan sustains a national debt that exceeds its entire economic output more than twice over. Europe manages a delicate web of obligations through the European Central Bank, a structure built to prevent collapse rather than to promote freedom. The consequences ripple downward into the daily lives of ordinary people. Homes are no longer places to live. They are collateral in a market driven by artificially cheap credit. Stocks no longer reflect productivity. They respond to liquidity injections and interest rate expectations. Even currencies, once symbols of national stability, now fluctuate with every whisper from central bankers. Everywhere the same transfer persists. Workers pay into the system. Governments remit interest to creditors. Institutions collect quietly year after year. Technology has only tightened the mechanism's grip. Debt is issued with algorithms priced by machine learning traded in microseconds. Central banks communicate through coded language aware that a single misplaced phrase could erase trillions in global value overnight. Financial markets behave like living organisms, reacting instantly to shifts in confidence devouring nations that hesitate. And beneath that speed lies a fragile truth none of this can stop. If governments slow their borrowing, growth stalls. If central banks slow their purchases, markets convulse. If households slow their spending, economies fracture. Debt has become the oxygen of modern civilization. The system breathes through expansion and suffocates through restraint. In 2025, humanity is more prosperous on paper than at any time in history. Yet it stands on a foundation of obligations so immense that even acknowledging them invites panic. And now we walk the same road that past empires once feared to enter. But the pattern had already begun. The architecture of modern debt does not merely mirror the past, it expands upon it, creating dependencies that are deeper, broader, and more inescapable than anything those early architects envisioned. Today, three structural forces shape the new world: institutional concentration, currency dominance, and universal indebtedness. First, the rise of the mega institutions. Asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street command sums that surpass the GDP of most countries. Their portfolios include the bonds of governments, the equity of corporations, and the savings of millions. They do not conquer territory, yet they influence policies. They do not write laws, yet they shape markets. When they shift allocations, nations feel earthquakes. When they withdraw liquidity, governments scramble. They are the silent shareholders of civilization. Second, the weaponization of currency. The US dollar sits at the center of global finance not because of moral authority, but because of structural necessity. Countries must accumulate it to repay debt, defend currencies, buy energy, and stabilize markets. This dependence grants the United States a form of influence unmatched by armies, the ability to cut nations off from the financial world. Sanctions function as economic sieges. Dollar scarcity becomes a modern blockade. Nations comply, not out of loyalty, but fear. Third, the debt of individuals. The mechanism has traveled from palaces to parliaments to households. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, medical debt individuals now live within the same perpetual cycle, once reserved for governments. Their futures are pledged to lenders. Their incomes become predictable streams for institutions. The architecture that once bound kings now binds families. This is the true legacy of the mechanism. It has woven itself into every decision, every budget, every aspiration. Governments borrow to survive elections. Corporations borrow to maintain valuations. Citizens borrow to experience basic milestones of life. The system is total. The dependencies are structural. And the parallels with the past are undeniable. History doesn't repeat, it evolves, and the next stage has started. Across 3 centuries, the world has drifted into a structure it no longer questions. A structure built without a single architect, yet perfected through the decisions of men who lived in different eras, spoke different languages, and served different empires. What unites them is not conspiracy, but design, a sequence of solutions that produced a system none of them fully foresaw, yet all of them empowered. Today, that system governs every nation on Earth. Debt is no longer a tool. It is the environment, a global atmosphere shaping policy, behavior, and destiny. Governments speak about growth, investment, innovation, yet every one of these ambitions flows through the same mechanism. Budgets begin with interest payments. Elections revolve around promises financed by borrowing. Central banks intervene in markets not to guide them, but to prevent the system from choking on its own obligations. The world no longer asks whether debt should be expanded. It only asks how fast. And beneath the political language, a deeper truth moves quietly. Debt has become the true infrastructure of power. Highways, currencies, armies, corporations, all depend on the ability to issue new obligations. Nations appear strong on the surface, but their foundations rest on a ledger that grows heavier each year. Some call this progress, others call it stability, but the mathematics of compounding interest calls it something else: inevitability. Look at the global order today. The United States maintains its strength through the dominance of its bonds, not the reach of its fleets. Japan survives through a central bank that absorbs its debt like an ocean absorbs rain. Europe remains intact only because default has been redefined as unthinkable. China, despite its ambitions, navigates an internal debt structure so immense that even small shocks trigger global waves. Everywhere, the same pattern holds. The modern world does not operate on productivity, it operates on refinancing. Debt is rolled, not repaid. Interest is serviced, not questioned. Growth is measured by expansion, not settlement. And the mechanism has woven itself into the lives of ordinary people. Homes are mortgaged for decades. Education is financed by loans that outlast the diplomas they purchase. Consumption is sustained by credit. Even retirement depends on the health of debt markets where pensions are invested in the obligations of governments that cannot meet them without borrowing even more. What began as a sovereign tool has become a personal condition. People no longer think of debt as a chain. They think of it as life. But every system carries within itself a prophecy, a direction that cannot be avoided, only delayed. For the global debt architecture, that prophecy is simple, cold, and absolute. The system must expand or it will collapse. There is no middle path. There is no steady state. There is only acceleration or failure. Picture this: trillions created with a keystroke, markets rising on liquidity instead of value, governments surviving through auctions that must never fail, institutions collecting the interest of nations they do not govern yet control. The world believes it is free because the chains are invisible, woven from contracts, instead of iron, reinforced through confidence instead of fear. But invisible chains are the hardest to break because most people never realize they are wearing them. As the cycle deepens, the questions grow sharper. What happens when confidence falters? What happens when interest consumes revenue? What happens when nations borrow not for growth, but simply to breathe? The prophecy does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. Empires once collapsed through invasion. Now they collapse through arithmetic. Debt is the quiet sovereign of the modern world, patient, precise, and absolute. And as the mechanism tightens, humanity moves toward a moment when the architecture reveals its final lesson. What was built to sustain civilization may ultimately determine how it ends.